Hey everybody, this is the fourth here, and in this video I just wanted to give you some tips to help you out with compression a little bit more. So my first tip here is to not overdo it. Compression can be very useful in achieving the best mix possible, but in many cases you don't need to use a lot of compression on each sound. Subtlety really can go a long way while using compression in your tracks. And overcompressing your sounds really takes away a lot of the punch and a lot of the character in some cases. And if you were to have every sound in your mix very compressed, it probably wouldn't end up sounding all that great. Because basically all of your sounds are going to have no dynamic range and there's going to be very little contrast between the sounds. And you're probably not going to have a lot of punch in your mix. And punch is very important in electronic dance music. So while you may use some pretty hard compression on certain sounds, and there's not really anything wrong with compressing certain sounds really hard, you really want to make sure that whatever compression settings you happen to be using are causing the end result to be desirable and to sound good. So you should be able to tell if you're overdoing compression. It should kind of not sound very good. You should notice that your sounds lose their punch, they sound wimpy. And at the same time, you should be able to hear when really hard compression might be necessary, or you might just want to do that to a certain sound because the end result will sound good to you. So there's nothing wrong with using really hard compression in certain cases, but you really do want to make sure the end result sounds good and make sure you're not overdoing it. And my next tip here is that you don't always need to compress your sounds. On production forums, it seems like people talk about compression all the time, and because of this, it might seem like compression is a cure-all for any problem you have while mixing, but that's really not the case. In my opinion, you really shouldn't do compression unless you know why. Unless you have a reason for compressing a certain sound, you shouldn't compress it. And so as a beginner, you probably will end up using compression a lot less than other people say that they use it, and a lot less than you will end up using it in the future. And that's just because a lot of the uses for compression, at least from my experience, are quite subtle. And I don't use compression on every sound. And in fact, I don't even use compression on very many of my sounds. And a part of that is just my personal workflow. It's what works for me. I know other people do use quite a bit of compression and they get great results as well. But really, you shouldn't be compressing unless you know why you're compressing. And just because you heard that you should compress your kicks doesn't mean that you really should compress your kicks. It all comes down to whether or not you're trying to achieve something. If you want to kind of fatten up your kick, then yes, you may apply some kind of compression. Or if you notice that your vocal sample gets too loud in certain parts, then yeah, you might want to use compression. But if you're just throwing on a compressor because you heard that other people do it and you might have heard that you should compress all your sounds, that's probably not really the best idea, because it can lead to you making decisions that aren't really optimal for the mix and could actually make things sound worse and end up providing you with a worse final mix. So you don't always need to compress. Don't pressure yourself into compressing when you don't really have a reason to compress. And really only compress if you have a specific reason that you know why you want to compress that sound. Now, my next tip here is that multi-band compression can affect sounds that normal compression would not affect. And this is really useful regarding very distorted sounds. Because if you're using a lot of distortion to create a sound, you're probably going to end up with a sound that doesn't have a lot of dynamics. And in fact, it might be kind of like a totally flat waveform. And if you're kind of having issues getting that to sit right in the mix, because it kind of sounds like it gets too loud at certain parts and other parts are too quiet, then multi-band compression might be the tool that you need in order to get it to sit right in the mix. Because even though the overall waveform may not have any dynamic range, if you isolate certain frequency bands, they very well might have a good amount of dynamic range that you can manipulate using a multiband compressor to help them sit in the mix. And this is especially going to be the case with, those modulated, distorted, fat bass sounds. So if you're having trouble getting a certain sound to fit in the mix because it gets too loud at certain parts, but normal compression isn't working, you might try multiband compression. And alternatively, if you find that using normal compression causes certain frequency ranges to get too quiet when it compresses the sound, then that's another case where you would want to possibly look into how multiband compression could be used. And my final tip for you here is to check out other tutorials, look up other compression techniques, and all that. In this tutorial, I really wanted to stick to the basics just to keep things nice and simple and not become too biased with the advice that I'm giving. There are a million different uses for compressors. There are a million different techniques out there that use compressors, and they're all great to know about. But at the same time, when you get to those levels of being more specific, the whole thing becomes a lot more subjective. So I definitely encourage you to look up other techniques, check out other tutorials, and read advice from professionals and all that. But take everything with a grain of salt, and always view it as a technique that they use, and kind of try to figure out why they use that and what it achieves in their mix, so that you can decide more objectively whether or not it will fit into your mixing process. If someone uses a certain technique, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the right way to do it. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will be right for you to do it the same way. All it means is it's something that they do and it works for them. And it's great to know about because it will allow you to either utilize it in your mixes as well, or it might just provide a different way to kind of think about things and possibly inspire you to come up with other similar techniques in your own mixing process. So definitely research more techniques, research more tutorials on compression, but make sure you take everything with a grain of salt. Never take anything as a rule that you should do all the time.